political. For the British government team who are negotiating at Maastricht, this is a practical matter. Britain's position on a single European currency, on greater political power being transferred to Europe, on the vexed question of federalism. But all those decisions depend on their approach to the basic question of whether further European integration is desirable. All three main political parties in their various ways favour it, but both Labour and Conservative harbour sceptics in their ranks. It cuts across party lines. Now, one group of witnesses we'll be hearing from believe that to go too far with the European Union would be a disaster. That the cases should grasp with enthusiasm the chance to be part of a united Europe, because the gains outweigh the losses. Would you welcome them both? We're going to be putting on this belief that, in the words of the motion, deeper European integration has little to offer the United Kingdom. Now, two distinguished QCs are going to argue the case. For the Eurosceptics, Elizabeth Appleby QC, head of the largest public law chambers in Britain, with extensive experience in commercial and European law as well. And arguing the opposite case, defending deeper European integration, Anthony Scrivener QC, this year's chairman of the Bar Council, who has appeared before the European Court often and who has a wide practice in common law. The rules are going to be very simple. Each side makes an opening statement, followed by examination and cross-examination of the witnesses on each side, and then each side will have a brief chance to sum up, and equal time will be given to each case over the debate as a whole. Now, our audience tonight are not a jury, they're not a sample, but they come from a generation who will be voting for the first time at the next general election. Most of them were born around 1973, the year we joined the European community. We don't say they represent the views of the nation as a whole, we don't say they represent the views of their generation, but it is their future which is at stake. And before this programme began, we put the motion to them that deeper European integration has little to offer the United Kingdom, and this was the result. 16% agree with that, 46% disagree, 38% don't know. And they have this programme in which to make up their minds. So there are hearts and minds still to be won on both sides. I call on Elizabeth Appleby, QC, to make the opening statement for the motion.
What is at stake at Maastricht? The answer is the future of democratic self-government and the welfare of the British people. Do you want Britain to remain an independent, self-governing country, or would you rather it became a province of a new European state? Our history books tell us how the Chartists and suffragists fought to get control of the ballot box at Westminster and how they got such control. Are you to hand over all that they fought for on a plate to the European community? Do you not have self-confidence in yourselves, in your own ability to survive and prosper within a free democracy? Or have you abandoned and despaired of that prospect so that you want Great Britain dissolved and transferred to European control? There will be control over social policy. Your wages, hours of work, taxes, laws will be legislated for, not from Westminster, but from Europe. You may be dissatisfied with the government of the day in Great Britain, but you know that it is accountable to you and that you can vote it out. You cannot vote out a European Parliament. Why can't we have cooperation, making sure that it's on a real cooperation on a level playing field? In today's world and tomorrow's, we all have to cooperate together, not only in Europe, but all over the world. We can cooperate together, and we must, to make the world a better place to live in the terms of security, defence, health, environmental matters, to name but a few. This must all be dealt with by way of worldwide cooperation. But none of this requires Great Britain to cease to be a self-governing nation and become absorbed in what will inevitably be a European superstate. It is sometimes suggested that we shall be isolated, left behind, but we shall show you tonight that this is a myth.
Thank you very much, Ms. Appleby. Now, Anthony Scrivener, QC, against the motion.
For hundreds of years, the nations of Europe have been engaged in war against each other, and millions of people have died. After the last great confrontation, the last World War, some of the nations of Europe got together and they agreed that there should be no more war, and they should enter into a treaty, the Treaty of Rome, so that they can work together. Britain joined that treaty in 1972. It's happened. One of the terms of that treaty was that we would work together towards an ever closer union among the people of Europe. And since 1972, we have been in Europe. There was a referendum, and the people wanted it. It involved giving up a degree of sovereignty, because European law, community law, overrides our law. From time to time, the nations have got together to meet and updated it. And in 1986, there was a single European Act. And once again, there was the proud statement in that act, which we all agreed to, that we should transform relations as a whole among the states into a European Union. There are 12 members at the moment. There are more waiting to join. Sweden and Austria, and the newly freed countries of Central Europe and Eastern Europe want to join. Our economy since 1972 has been part of Europe. So that has been the history for the last 20 years. And now there are some who say we should stop now in the tracks. It's like being on a train, and we should stop, get off the train, and walk back to a platform, a station, upon which no one is there. And if you hear the other side talk in this debate about us leaving the train and leaving it now, ask them to spell out what the alternative is. Because we either have to join it or we bump along behind. What the future holds is a matter for discussion, and the great nations of Europe will discuss it. We should proceed step by step the development of political institutions which will keep the community democratic and effective. And this great debate has this opportunity for you. You will be able to understand the reasons given by those taking part for the views they take.
Mr. Scrivener, your time's up. Thank you very much. Now, Elizabeth Appleby will present her first three witnesses. Miss Appleby.
My first witness is the Right Honourable Peter Shaw, Labour MP for Bethnal Green and Stepney, and former Cabinet Minister. Mr. Shaw, what is at stake at Maastricht?
Very large issues indeed. It is our self-government, it's our independence, it's our freedom of action as an independent nation-state. And what we are threatened with, and I use the word threat deliberately, is the immersion of Britain into what is going to become a European federal state, in which we will be one of several, but we shall have lost that priceless asset of independence and the ability to govern ourselves.
Do you consider the setting up of an independent central bank free from democratic control will be of benefit to the British people?
No, I don't. I think this is, of course, only one area of what is involved. But if we were to find ourselves no longer able to decide, for example, our own bank rate, our own interest rate, our own mortgage rates, our own exchange rates, if, in other words, we were caught in a European central bank and a European single currency, we would really have lost the major strategic powers for controlling, guiding, managing our own national economy, with all that that means for unemployment, for inflation, and for all the other things that enter into people's daily lives.
If we do sign the treaty at Maastricht, will there be control over the British government's expenditure?
Yes, indeed. It's one of the extraordinary features of the treaty. The governments are not even to be trusted and allowed to spend what they think they can spend and to borrow what they think they can borrow. In other words, they're to be limited to an arbitrary amount of public borrowing so that the major objective of the treaty, which is, frankly, deflation and price stability, is achieved above all other economic objectives.
And if there is excessive expenditure, what will be the consequence?
The protocol concerned has a whole list of penalties, including fines which are to be inflicted upon British governments, special deposits to be called up from their banks, loss of loan facilities, and a number of other penalties.
Will, in fact, the British government be reduced to a charged, capped local authority?
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. We would be so reduced. We would, in fact, have given over entirely our economic self-government to the European institutions, the European bankers, and a European central bank.
Is there any benefit to the British people in having a single European currency?
It's a negligible benefit. As those who have been abroad in Europe well know, all you have to do is to produce your Euro card and you pay 1.6%, as I think is the going rate, in order to cash a cheque. The idea that you're losing vast sums of money simply by changing from your own currency to another is ridiculous.
What is the importance of the exchange rate?
It's a very crucial means of adjustment between one country and another. If you found you had no ability to control your own exchange rate, and you were caught in an economic system with another more powerful industrial and competitive nation, you would find increasingly that unemployment would grow in your own country and that trade and industrial development would switch to the country where the economy was strongest. The one way that we have, all countries have so far, of adjusting to that is making changes in their exchange rate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Miss Appleby. Mr. Scrivener.
Mr. Shaw, you always have been against European unity, is that correct?
I've been against, at an earlier stage, Britain's membership of the European community, but I accept the fact that we are members now.
Are you in favour of the social charter?
I'm not particularly enamoured by the social charter because there isn't a single thing in it that the next Labour government, if it wishes to enact, would not be able to enact.
Can you tell me, if in fact there is one currency, it would mean that the ECU, which would be the name of the new currency, would be able to compete with the dollar and the yen, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. At the moment, I hear from business people actually calling to give evidence that there could be high transaction costs if different nations of Europe had different currencies.
I think you've been misinformed, Mr. Scrivener, about that.
You don't think so?
The Caccini report said the average transaction cost for firms dealing in foreign countries in Europe was 0.3% of costs.
And how many invoices do you need if you want to send your goods to each member of the 12 countries?
12.
Is the answer 12?
Or 11, I should say.
11.
Mm-hmm.
11.
Yeah.
What about if we did enter into Europe, there would be a single currency? Would that not be a safeguard against inflation?
Not necessarily. It would depend on the relationship between that single currency and other currencies in the rest of the world.
Now tell us, what do you propose if we don't join Europe?
I propose that we stay as we are, as members of the European community, free to trade, freedom of capital movement, and substantial freedom of movement of people taking jobs in one part of the community and the other. That is perfectly compatible with continuing to make our own laws and ruling ourselves as an independent country.
Mr. Shaw, you've forgotten one thing, that there are 11 other members of Europe and they will have gone.
No, they won't. They'll be there as members of the European community, just as we will be. What they will have embarked upon is a quite separate enterprise, and a very foolish one, which will be self-defeating, of trying to establish a single currency. They will rue the day that they started upon that line.
They will be operating ECU as a common monetary currency. We'll be operating sterling.
Yes, indeed. Just as throughout the post-war period, the United States of America operated the dollar, and we had to make transactions in dollars when that was appropriate. We shall make transactions with the ECU where that is appropriate.
Every time a British company wants to engage in business with Europe, there's going to be a cost penalty. Every transaction will cost them more to do business with their own European partners.
I don't think I've already answered that. It is a tiny fraction of the cost of total transactions, and really it is negligible in terms of what we're talking about.
We will have thrown away the chance of London becoming the financial capital of Europe.
No, I don't think so. London became the financial capital of Europe in the 1950s and 60s when we weren't part of the European community, and yet we became the principal centre for the euro dollar. And that could well happen again.
Mr. Shaw, it would be total nonsense. London can't be the financial capital of Europe. It's in sterling. The rest of Europe's operating ECU.
But the major purpose of a financial centre is to deal in foreign currencies. And London will go on dealing with the dollar, the yen and the ECU as long as it is profitable so to do.
And what sort of message is going to be put out to the rest of Europe? Are they liable to invest in England?
I think it's a message that most European countries will be delighted to hear, particularly those in Eastern Europe, which are now insisting upon self-government and freedom and breaking up vast federations where they have previously lived, much to their disadvantage and their cost.
Mr. Shaw, you would throw away any chance of being a leader in Europe.
Mr. Shaw, thank you very much.
I will call my second witness, Mr. Andrew Cook, chairman of William Cook plc, a Sheffield-based steel foundry group, an international group employing 3,000 people. Mr. Cook, could I read to you from the then Prime Minister's broadcast to the nation on the 8th of July 1971, the Prime Minister being then Mr. Edward Heath, as to whether we should enter into the European community. In answer to the question, why should we go in, he gave us one of the main reasons. For our coal and steel interests, the safeguards are there as they've always been, but now there are greater opportunities for both industries in a much bigger market. Have you benefited from entering Europe?
Not at all. In fact, the UK steel castings industry has dropped in size by 2/3. It is 1/3 of the size that it was at that time, and the biggest reason for this reduction is not lack of investment, is not inefficiency. Steel industry in this country is the most efficient in the world. It is directly due to subsidized imports from the European community nations other than this one.
And therefore, the game that you're playing, is it a fair game and on a level playing field?
No, we play according to totally different rules. In this country, profit, efficiency, you earn your own money, you pay your taxes, you sell your goods on a level playing field. In Europe, particularly in Spain and Portugal, the steel industry is a social service. It is supported by government subsidies, or that is, indeed, if it isn't directly state-owned. Two examples I can give you. One in Portugal, which is state-owned. It has net debt of £38 million. That means if you're given it as a present tomorrow, you immediately owe £38 million. Another one in Spain has net debt of £25 million. Again, you owe £25 million, you get it as a present. Yet those two companies between them are directly responsible for the loss of 1,500 jobs in this country over the last 3 years. And under British rules, they would have closed down long ago.
And at what price do those European countries sell their products into the UK market?
Below cost. As far as they're concerned, efficiency enters into it not at all. Profit's nothing to do with it. They solely exist to provide employment for the working people in the Basque Country and in Portugal, and the cost of that is the British working people who lose their jobs as a result.
And how would it be possible to pay for the job losses that you have identified?
Well, it's the taxpayer. Already, the British taxpayer is paying to keep the Spanish and Portuguese worker employed, selling product at below cost into Britain. And you get caught either way. If we go on as we are, we will go on paying for the Spanish and the Portuguese producer to produce like this.
Is it going to help your industry to have Europe telling you how much you can give to your workers in the form of wages and what conditions they should work under?
Not at all. As far as we're concerned, the least state intervention, the better. All we ask is to play on a level playing field. I believe in free and fair competition, but I believe that the unfair and unfree competitor who dumps his product in this country should be excluded.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cook.
The present government doesn't believe in subsidies, does it?
No.
Do you believe in subsidies?
No.
And you've been confronted with, you say, with countries in Europe subsidizing.
Exactly.
What did you do about it?
I've reported it to the European Commission.
Thank you. You did, didn't you? Because the European Commission, you think, will stop it.
No.
Is that right?
You've interrupted me halfway through my answer.
I apologise.
I reported it to the European Commission in a vain attempt to see whether what they say they believe in, i.e. fair and free trade, is a reality. Well, 3 years ago, I made my first complaint. I have so far spent in excess of £250,000 pursuing it, and absolutely nothing whatsoever has been done. Far from that, the European Commission is engaged in finding every loophole they can to wriggle out of their overt obligations under the Treaty of Rome.
Well, you've had problems, apparently. I think you complained about the DTI here not helping you as well. Is that right?
That's nothing to do with it.
Have you complained to the DTI?
We're talking about European competition.
Have you complained to the DTI?
Of course one takes these sort of things
to the DTI. If there was no European
community, would you expect me not to take it?
If there was no European community, to whom would you have complained?
If there was no European community,
yes,
one would complain to one's politicians, wouldn't one?
Your problem in your industry is that you've been squeezed by high interest rates. Isn't that right, Mr. Cook?
Not at all. That has nothing whatsoever to do with it. High interest rates are nothing whatsoever to do with these problems at all. I am being squeezed by subsidised producers in Spain and Portugal.
And your best way of dealing with subsidised producers is to have one market.
No,
so you have a level playing field. That's right, isn't it?
Absolute nonsense. If you have one market, you will find that the free trader, the person that is not subsidised, will be ploughed into the ground.
Thank you.
Mr. Cook, can I just... Andrew Cook. Mr. Cook? Could I just... All right. Mr. Cook, just to clarify, could I ask you one question? If within Europe there was a level playing field, if it were possible to produce a level playing field, where would your business stand?
At the top. We are the largest and most efficient producer in Europe, so if it genuinely was a level playing field, we will be very profitable. More so than we are, we would employ an additional 1,500 people overnight.
And do you believe it is possible to use the European Commission to get there in the long run?
No, because the European Commission is bending over backwards to cater for individual sectoral interests, which are so divergent, in fact, ideologically entirely different from those of this country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. My next witness is Mr. Patrick Robertson, who is the head of the Bruges group. Mr. Robertson, if Britain does not play a part in federal Europe, with all the effective decisions being taken in Brussels and Strasbourg, will Great Britain be left behind, isolated, and unable to make decisions and shape its destiny?
Absolutely not. It's one of the biggest myths and threats that those people that want to centralise power in Europe put forward, that somehow a country of 56 million people with an economy which is one of the top 7 in the world, which exports half its products outside of the European community, which produces more per capita than the Japanese, which has 64% of its overseas investment outside of the European community. I mean, for anyone to believe that a country of this size and military and political importance would somehow get sidelined by the European community is frankly a ridiculous argument to put forward.
Do we have a surplus or trade deficit with Europe?
We have, over the last 10 years, a trade deficit with the European community of some £40 billion, whereas we have a surplus with the rest of the world which amounts to some £75 billion. And this enables us to be able to keep our economy going in these difficult circumstances.
If we do not enter Europe in a union manner, will the City of London's attraction as the largest international finance centre weaken or disappear?
It will certainly not disappear. In fact, having listened to the earlier witnesses and the earlier point of view put across by the opposition, it's extraordinary to suggest that the financial city of London, which for 10 years was not part of the European exchange rate mechanism, and yet which became the greatest dealer in Eurobond and Eurodollar markets, is another crazy argument to put forward. But what is important here is what the other currency in the European community would actually be like. If it is not a good currency, then I would prefer to hang on to sterling.
In the papers today, it was suggested by Germany that if Great Britain refuses to sign the treaty, the other European countries would form a centralised union, in effect, immediately. What do you say to that?
Well, on a political level, that seems to me to be a rather insensitive sort of threat. Again, the lack of debate taking place at the moment. But in practical terms, it's wishful thinking. It would be quite impossible for the European community to move forward and have a centralised union without the acceptance of the United Kingdom and her parliament.
If Britain refuses to sign the treaty at Maastricht, will its present relationship with Europe suffer?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, we have such a huge trading deficit with the European community, I would imagine that our negotiating position will be quite strong, because they would have to come to a very good accommodation with us. We would still be a member of the European community. We would still be taking a leading part in deciding European law. We would still play a leading part in shaping the development of the community for the future, widening it, making more countries become a member of it, sharing free trade, but we would not have to put up with the costs of a massive social charter. We would not have to put up with the costs of relaying vast sums of money from one part of Europe to the other to make up for the loss of the exchange rate tool. And this will be something which, in fact, in my view, and the view of many economists in the Bruges Group, would leave Britain in a thoroughly competitive position.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Robertson, Lord Harris of High Cross, was he a former chair of the Bruges Group?
Yes, that is correct.
I think he said what a clever chap you were, is that right?
That's very kind of him.
But he added that you are easily bored by detail. Would that be correct?
Well, not quite as much as you've shown yourself to be.
Let's see how much detail you've done. What research have you carried out as to what the future of Britain will be outside Europe?
Oh, we've conducted quite a lot of research, as a matter of fact.
Have you produced a document?
We have, in fact, produced a number of documents on this issue.
Well, you better tell us what it says. But what is the alternative? If the others go ahead on their own, together with 2 other nations who want to join, where are we?
Well, I've already answered that question. If the other European countries wish to go ahead and form a centralized federal union, then they should be invited to do so outside of the treaty institutions of the community.
Mr. Ridley, is he a member of the Bruges Group?
No, he's not a member of the Bruges
But
Group.
he's a member of the Conservative Party.
That's
He's
as
against
maybe.
Europe, isn't he?
No, we're not against Europe, Mr. Scrivener. As you know perfectly well, I've reiterated that the Bruges Group is entirely in favour of the European community, and it'd be far better if your questions in the future did not attribute to the people on this side that they are, in fact, against Europe.
Right. Thank you very much. What Mr. Ridley was suggesting was that we could be like Hong Kong, never been part of any fixed parity arrangement. Do you see that as a model for us, Hong Kong?
Well, any one of these possibilities could be open to us. We could, in fact, have a currency like the yen, which, again, is a small country. It's perfectly possible for Japan to have a very good currency. We should be able to do the same thing.
Well, in your research papers you've got, what does it propose? Hong Kong as a model?
No, we haven't put forward any explicit proposals, mostly because we do not believe that it is, in fact, possible economically to have a European currency joining economies like Greece and Denmark and Germany and Portugal.
At the moment, Mr. Cook appears to be having a problem, doesn't he?
No, not particularly.
I see. He's pretty happy, is he?
Well, forgive me, I misunderstood your question. I thought a problem with your questions. Economically, yes, he's having a terrible problem at the moment.
Yes. And Britain's economy, what, it's slowing down by 2.5% each year?
Well, we're back onto growth at this moment in time.
So who will be our trading partners if we move out of Europe?
Well, we're not moving out of Europe, as I've already said, because we'll still be part of the single market, we'll still be part of the European community. 50% and over of our manufactured trade goes outside of Europe. It is our belief that Britain needs to widen her choices, not get herself tied up and locked into a Western European state.
Will it be more expensive for us to deal with our partners in Europe?
Not necessarily. You mentioned transaction costs earlier on. In actual fact, if there was a cost for us to be dealing with a state which dealt in ECU, there would equally be a cost for them to do trading with us. Since they, in fact, need British trade, we would, in fact, be gaining from a vast amount of transaction costs.
But there's a trading deficit in our part, isn't there?
Well, unfortunately, that is the case. We can only survive because we can compete freely with the rest of the world.
The answer, Mr. Robertson, is there is nowhere else for us to go.
Well, I mean, you keep on saying things like that. Sounds like bumper stickers to me. I'm British, and I'm young, and I'm British, and this audience is young, and we're British. I'm a European. I've lived in different parts of Europe. I want choice. I want the ability for my country to stand up and do what it wants to do, not get stuffed into a corner because you tell us we don't have any choice.
Well, the reason I put that to you is because despite all the money that's poured into your group, you've got no explicit proposal as an alternative, have you?
We have plenty of alternative proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Well, we've heard from Peter Shaw about the restrictions on British freedom. We've heard from Andrew Crook about the problems of his part of the steel industry, and from Patrick Robinson about his view of Britain's future if it's not part of a further integration of Europe. Now, Miss Appleby's last witness is Norman Tebbit, former Conservative Party chairman, one of the most vigorous campaigners against Britain's going down the road towards federalism. Miss Appleby.
Mr. Tebbit, are you opposed to our membership of the European community?
No, quite to the contrary. I campaigned for Britain to enter the community. I've campaigned for Britain to stay within the community. I believe the community has brought enormous benefits to both Europe as a whole and to Great Britain.
And therefore, can it be suggested with any degree of force that you are anti-European?
No, that's a silly and stupid thing to say. It would be madness to be anti our neighbours in Europe. After all, there's 180 million of them apart from ourselves in the community at the moment.
What experience of the community have you?
Well, for 8 years as a minister in various departments, I negotiated within Europe in the Council of Ministers on a virtual weekly basis. Amongst other things, I negotiated the European Steel Industry Agreement. It was an agreement which banned subsidy, which said that other countries should reduce their steelmaking capacity because of the crisis of overcapacity in the European steel industry. That agreement has not been implemented, as you have heard, and it's not a question that it was a bad agreement, it's simply an agreement which is not being implemented.
And whose job was it to implement that agreement if there was a complaint?
It's the job of the Commission, but sad to say, the Commission does not seem to be even-handed in its dealings, or alternatively, other governments in Europe do not choose to implement the laws which are handed down to them.
Is there any difference between the integration of European states that is proposed in the Maastricht Treaty and the original aims when we entered into the community in 1972?
Yes, indeed, enormous differences. When we entered into the community, it was called the European Economic Community. It laid heavy stress upon the benefits of integrating our economies and creating a free trade area across Western Europe. Nowadays, of course, it's become the European Community, and now it is proposed at Maastricht we take steps down the road to a federal destiny, including a single currency. I believe that would be a mistake. I believe that there is still much to be done in Europe as a family of nations. Those nations in ever closer union, yes, cooperating more and more closely together for our mutual benefit, but retaining our identity as separate nations and our ability to sack our own governments and institute different policies if we so wish.
Do you think the British people would like to be governed by people who do not speak their language?
I do not believe that anywhere in the world one can find examples of a harmonious nation where there is a difference of language. In fact, if we look across the world, and most particularly at Eastern Europe now, we see it perfectly clear that people will not be governed by those who do not share their language. That's the first requirement for a democratic system.
It is proposed that there should be a European Parliament. If the British people were dissatisfied with what that Parliament was doing, could they remove the Parliament or exercise their feelings?
Well, at the most, as it is proposed now, we would be able to change 81 members of that Parliament. It gives a sense of the proportion if I say it is proposed that Germany should have 99 members in that Parliament. So we would be but small beer compared with the rest. It is my belief that if the people of this country wish to vote for Mr. Shaw's Labour Party to institute a socialist system in Britain, they should have the right to do so. If they wish to elect a Conservative government for a Conservative policy, they should have the right to do so. They should not be dependent upon the views of Germans, Portuguese, French, Italians and the others as to what sort of government they wanted.
There is now a requirement that there should be a social charter where the European Parliament would lay down wages, hours of work, conditions of work, taxes, etc. Is that going to be beneficial to the British people?
No, it is not. We are perfectly capable of making our own decisions on these matters. Let me put it this way. It was not I, but Mr. Wedgwood Benn, who in the debate in the House of Commons recently observed, it is not a matter of whether Madam Thatcher or Madam Papandreou, that is the Commissioner for Social Affairs, would give you better maternity leave and better creches. The issue is whether you can sack Madam Thatcher or whether you can sack Madam Papandreou. As we know, it is possible to sack Madam Thatcher. We should know it is not possible to sack Madam Papandreou. That is the democratic deficit. What is more, if we look at the countries of Europe, countries such as Portugal and Greece have undercapitalized industries. They cannot bear those heavy costs which can be carried in countries like Germany and Britain, where we are well capitalized and well organized in our industry. So if we had a single currency and we had those social charter systems of the burdens imposed on those countries, they would not be able to get up and succeed against the Germans and ourselves. They would be condemned to relying upon regional aid, money given by us and German taxpayers.
And who are the greatest contributors to the European budget?
Well, ourselves and the Germans. And we would continue to be. Indeed, we would become even bigger contributors under any system of single currency because the other economies of the poorer states would be held back.
Would our children and grandchildren thank us for signing the treaty at Maastricht?
I am sure they would not. It would cause the collapse of the European community as we know it now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tebbit.
Mr. Tebbit, are you in favour of the British government having the right to manipulate interest rates before a general election?
Mr. Scrivener, I am in favour of the British people deciding which government they want. If they want to elect a government which manipulates interest rates, they have the right to do so. If they want to elect one that doesn't, they have the right to do that.
You're in favour of a government which can manipulate interest rates before general election?
No, sir, you're putting words in my mouth. I am answering your question, and I am answering in a straight fashion.
Is it yes or no?
There is not a yes or no answer to a question of that kind.
I'll leave it there. If you join Europe, if you progress into Europe, the government won't be able to do that, will it?
If we go into Europe on the basis of a single currency, the right to manipulate interest rates before elections will fall to a separate body in Europe. Exactly. There are 12 governments in Europe. If they have a general election on average every 4 years, there will be 3 general elections a year. Now, that will be a considerable temptation, if there is a temptation to fiddle interest rates, to do so 3 times a year instead of once in 4 or 5.
You don't have elections that often, if I may say so. Mr. Tebbit, can I ask something else?
You've missed the point, Mr. Scrivener, which is not uncommon.
Mr. Tebbit, you've got another problem, haven't you, with progressing into Europe? That's the social policy. You've been advocating the dismantling of national pay bargaining, haven't you?
Yes, indeed,
right.
And that has been extremely successful. Yes. It has meant that we have become considerably more competitive. It has enabled our steel industry to work effectively.
You're against there being a 48-hour minimum working week.
I am against people imposing conditions on us from outside. If a government is elected here and decides that it should limit the working week to 48 hours, so well and good. I am not in favour of it being imposed on us from outside.
Have you had the problems in your constituency that Mr. Heath talked about during his debate, of elderly people being sacked and younger ones being taken on at a cheaper price? Have you had that problem in your constituency?
Mr. Scrivener, I have not had that brought to me as a problem, but I do know how much of a problem it is right the way across Europe in other countries which are supposed to have legislation to stop that happening, but legislation which is not observed.
It's better than having no legislation at all, isn't it?
I take it you as a lawyer would think that it would be best if other people obeyed the law as well as us.
Yes, it would be nice to have the law in place. Can we talk about sovereignty?
If you wish.
Yes. Can you tell me, Mr. Tebbit, is there any other country in Europe except ours when this country could go to war without recalling Parliament?
Well, I don't know about other countries' laws.
That happened to us, didn't it? We went to war in Iraq without even having to recall Parliament.
Yes, indeed. We went to war under a United Nations mandate.
We didn't have to go to Parliament.
And if you will forgive me, Mr. Scrivener, had we relied upon the other countries, nothing would have happened in Iraq to prevent the dictator Saddam Hussein continuing his acts of genocide.
The government could do that without having to go to Parliament.
That is so, and that has been the way in which we have operated for 900 years. That is the reason that we were able to stand up against the German onslaught in 1940 when others could not.
That went to Parliament that time. What about the guarantee of civil rights? There are no guarantees of civil rights under our Constitution, are there?
I think that's an absurd remark.
We've got the worst record of human rights at Strasbourg, isn't that correct?
If you're telling me that you believe that people in this country are worse treated than in Europe, I would like to tell you, sir, of one of my constituents who has been in jail in Spain now for 3 years and has still not been charged. Under Spanish law, you can be kept in jail for up to 4 years before you face a charge. I suspect you as a lawyer would be outraged at that happening in this country.
And I find the same thing happens here, Mr. Tebbit, too.
Well, I think that it would be very surprising. It would be very surprising. It would be very surprising if you could find in our Constitution a law which says that a man is allowed to be kept in jail for 4 years without being charged.
If you're in favour of parliamentary democracy, are you in favour of giving more power to the European Parliament?
I don't believe that the European Parliament would be effective because it is divided by language. It would not be an effective way of controlling an executive.
The answer is no. You're not in favour, are you?
No, because I am not in favour of this country being governed by people who live outside this country.
But we can elect members to the European Parliament. Why are you against giving that Parliament more power?
Mr. Scrivener, you may be a good lawyer, but your arithmetic is poor. We would have 81 members out of 538.
But it's an elected body. Why would you give them more power?
I've told you, Mr. Scrivener, and I repeat it again. I'm sorry you're not able to understand that I believe that these islands and these people here should be governed by the people they elect, not the people who are elected by Germans, Italians, Frenchmen, Danes, Greeks and others. It is, if I may say so, Mr. Scrivener, not your country, it's their country.
I quite agree. Will you look at that audience for a moment, Mr. Tebbit, and tell me this point about language? You see what backgrounds they come from?
Yes. And Mr. Scrivener, I do, and I will tell you, they come from many different backgrounds. They share one language. They see the newspapers in one language. They see their television programs in one language. That is the reality of a state. And you cannot find for me a state which is divided by language, which is a happy state.
You better tell that to the Welsh.
Mr. Scrivener, I will tell it to the Welsh and I will tell it to them in English and they will understand me. They may not understand you.
Thank you, Mr. Scrivener. Mr. Tebbit, just before you leave the witness box, you've talked about Britain having the power as of now to leave the Treaty of Rome, that we have that power as a sovereign state.
I haven't talked about it, but we do have it, yes.
You've said that we should look at what would happen if we did, because we did have that power. You wrote about it.
Yes, indeed. And I think our conclusion would be that we should not repudiate the Treaty of Rome.
But can I just ask you this? If the decision is to go further towards integration, and it turned out to be the kind of disaster that your side of the argument is describing, in your opinion, would Britain have the right to withdraw and to start again on a different tack?
We would have that right, because the amendments to the treaty which are being proposed at Maastricht would be part of the Treaty of Rome. So Parliament would, at the end of the day, have the right to repudiate that treaty. I do not believe that right would be exercised. If what I believe to be the outcome of the road on which we are now to be set, apparently, at Maastricht, came to pass, then I think we would be not the only country that would be discontented. And I think there would be a move to further reform the treaty and go back to the path on which we have been so successful over the last 20 years.
So we wouldn't be permanently giving up sovereignty?
We would be giving up our sovereignty bar that one saviour. And we would, of course, be accepting that unless we did that, that our laws would be overridden by European laws and we would be governed in terms of our tax and every part of our life more and more from outside. If that went on from long enough as a state of fact, it would eventually become a state of law.
Mr. Tebbit, thank you very much indeed. Well, that completes the case for the motion that deeper European integration has little to offer the United Kingdom. Now we're going to hear the case against the motion, and as before, Anthony Scrivener this time will introduce his three witnesses. Mr. Scrivener.
Sir Christopher Tugendhat. He's been a journalist, an MP, he's director of several companies, including Abbey National, but he served for 8 years as one of Britain's 2 commissioners in Europe. Mr. Tugendhat, are you in favour of the European Parliament having more power?
Yes, I certainly am in favour of the European Parliament having more power. We in Britain believe in democracy. You have very powerful central institutions in the European community, the Council of Ministers and the European Commission. It is right that they should be accountable to directly elected representatives. In Britain, we are able to control British ministers in what they do in the service of the British Crown. It is important that the European institutions, in which ministers from all countries meet, and the European Commission should likewise be subject to democratic accountability on a European basis.
Is the Abbey National into Europe?
Yes, the Abbey National has subsidiaries in France, Italy and Spain.
In your opinion, what will be the effect if we do not join in the monetary union?
If we don't join into the monetary union, we will be placing ourselves at a great disadvantage. I'm not going to say that we would fail to survive or anything dire or extreme of that nature. because we have survived many tragedies in the past, but we would be putting ourselves at a very great handicap against our competitors. It is already quite difficult to compete on equal terms with some of the best educated, best run, most powerful countries in the world. It is better not to put yourself at a handicap and to operate on a level playing field.
How does accountability work in Europe under the present institutions?
It works inadequately. It works inadequately because at the moment the Council of Ministers as a body is not subject to very much democratic control, and of course the European Commission, which makes proposals and which administers the result, is subject to the European Parliament, but in my view not to a sufficient degree.
What would be your view if we stopped at this stage and tried to get out of Europe?
Well, I think that we would find that there would be a number of disadvantages. The first and most important is not an economic one. All of us are facing the same challenges in the world, the same challenges and opportunities in what was the Soviet Union, in Eastern and Central Europe, in competing with the Japanese, in dealing with the United States. It is not to our advantage that there should be three superpowers, Europe, Japan, and the United States, and that we should be excluded. We would suffer economically, in my view, because all those companies from the United States and Japan and elsewhere that have come to this country to invest in order to enter the European market would find themselves at a disadvantage. We would finally be at a disadvantage because we would not be influencing the rule-making and the law-making in our biggest single market, by far our biggest single market.
If we had a common currency, the ECU, how would that be able to market and compete against the dollar and the yen?
If we had a common currency in the ECU, it would certainly be a great advantage to British industry, and I think most people in British industry hold that view, because it would remove an important element of uncertainty. At the moment, because of the fluctuations in the pound against other European currencies, there is a great deal of uncertainty, of needless uncertainty, facing British manufacturers. It would also be to the advantage of us to have a currency which could operate on a greater basis of parity with the dollar and the yen, so that one was not subject to the same sort of instabilities on a worldwide basis.
Thank you.
Mr. Tugendhat, so you told us that the Abbey National is now in France, Italy and Spain. So the present position that we have with Europe lets people into those countries without hindrance, does it not?
The present situation is, of course, the result of all the moves that have been taking place towards a single European market. And when the Abbey National went into these countries, before I arrived there, but quite rightly did it do so, it was believing that there would be continued moves towards a single European market.
Yes, but you're not answering the question. The question is that there's been no difficulty with that particular entity going into Europe.
I made my position quite clear, Madam, in answer to Mr. Scrivener's questions when I said that we would be placing ourselves at a handicap if we are not part of the rule-making and the law-making, and if our currency is in a different block from those of the other countries. It would not be impossible, but we would be placing ourselves at a disadvantage. And my experience is that you don't usually succeed if you put yourself at a handicap.
But what is the disadvantage?
The disadvantage is, if you look at the Scandinavians, in order to deal with Europe in the European economic area, they have, in effect, had to accept all the rules which were made by other people without having a say in forming those rules. We have very important economic interests in this country. It is extremely important that we should play a part in the rule-making. It is also very important that in our dealings with the rest of the world, we should play an important part in influencing the European position.
Mr. Tugendhat, no one's suggesting that we would not play a part in the rule-making. No one is suggesting that we do not want cooperation and harmony.
How do you think we could play a part in the rule-making for the monetary union if we're not members of it? I really don't understand.
Why should we hand Great Britain and all its power to control itself to the Europeans?
We would not be doing that. We ourselves, the Europeans, we would be pooling sovereignty. Our environments are interdependent, our economies are integrated, we face the same range of problems in the world. It is right that we should pool our efforts in order to try to find solutions. The age of living in an island, cut off from everybody else, not worrying what happens elsewhere, is over. And while it lasted, it involved us in terrible wars.
That is just nonsensical, is it not?
You think the Second World War is nonsensical? You should read your history
Mr.
books.
Tugendhat, I'm not suggesting that it is not sensible. Or it's not. Your position, you were a commissioner in Europe, and did you act on behalf of the British people?
I acted on behalf of the European interest as a whole, in which the United Kingdom is an integral part, and I wrote when I came home, and I'm sure you read it when you did your homework, that I believe that the best form of union is one that is based on the continued existence of the nation states, and I am proud to be British, and because I am British, I am European.
Well, the answer to the question is that you did not act on behalf of the British people, you acted on behalf of the community.
I acted on behalf of the European community of which Britain is a part, and Britain's interest and that of its neighbours. Are you saying that a Scotsman can't be a good Briton, or a Welshman can't be a good Briton? A Scotsman can be just as good a Briton as anyone else, and a Briton can be just as good a European as anybody else.
You're out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I call Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt is a member of the German Parliament. He's a chairman of a parliamentary group on foreign affairs, defence and development in that country, and he's an expert on European matters. Mr. Schmidt, you come from Germany. Can you tell us, what are the chances, if Britain decides not to go along with the others, what are the chances in Europe, the rest of Europe, going on its own?
First of all, let me say that I think that's a success for Europe, that a young German can discuss in your country, in London, about this topic. And this shows that the future is for common European policy. What will go on in Germany, in other countries, if the UK refuses to join the treaty in Maastricht? I think they will go on and ask the UK to come. But I personally, I would really prefer to have the UK at the table and discuss and fixing the rules of the game, and not to come later, maybe in a way of take it or leave it.
Where do you think that Britain's experience can help you most in the development of Europe?
Experience of democracy, of stability.
And so far as monetary union is concerned, are you in favor of monetary union?
I'm in favor of monetary union. My country has the strongest currency in Europe, but we are sure that we are not strong enough to face the Japanese and the North American challenge for the next years.
How strong would the European yeku be compared with the yen and the dollar?
I think it could be rather strong, maybe one of the leading currencies of the world.
Thank you.
Mr. Schmidt, Volkswagen make their cars, do they not, on Saturdays?
That's right.
And indeed Spain do.
That's right.
Why should a social charter restrict hours of work?
This charter should fix the minimum social rights, social laws all over Europe, because I couldn't understand if we would only fix economical, environmental rights and not social rights for all these who are working in these factories.
What is wrong with the British industrial relations that requires Germans and Europe to interfere with our social policies?
Not only your social policy, but also the German social policy is influenced by the common European policy. And I think that's one of the basic rules in Europe, that everybody, every country should give its contribution to a common economy and common policy. And policy includes, in this way, also social policy.
How can you equalize or attempt to equalize labor unit costs across continents containing diverse cultures and social traditions?
I think this is one of those questions in my country which is discussed very, very long. We have very high social costs. We have a high sophisticated social system. And we have problems because some of our factories are going to Portugal or to Spain to produce there cheaper. But we say yes to Europe because, as seen as a whole, there is more progress for Europe, for European economy, as it would be otherwise.
Spain and Portugal, of course, are less wealthy than Germany, aren't they?
That's right.
Won't they be restricted in the way they can compete with Germany unless capital is provided?
They get many capital from Germany coming there,
yes.
Also from your country,
yes.
And this helps those countries coming up.
That's it. They do get a lot of capital and subsidies paid for by the Germans and the British. What happens when the German and British taxpayer says, I've had enough of
That's not a question of subsidies. That's a question of capital. Capital goes to those countries where it can produce and make advantage. Maybe if European community and European Union is really completed, those countries who are not member or who are not member on this step, the first, second or third step, they will get problems to have capital coming into their country.
The short answer is, Mr. Schmidt, is that the Germans and the British who will be paying for that price, is it not?
The Germans and the British should not all the time paying, but they should keep in mind that they don't not only pay, but also have great advantages.
Christian Schmidt, thank you very much indeed.
Richard Branson is the founder and chairman of the Virgin Group. He runs an airline. He holds the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing by ship. And also he's the first man across the Atlantic by hot air balloon. Mr. Branson, are you keen to get into Europe?
Very keen.
Are you already in Europe?
Very much so.
What do you say about transaction costs?
I think they're very expensive, and I would like to get rid of them if possible.
Have you got retailing businesses across Europe?
We do.
What about state-protected airlines?
I think that state-protected airlines and subsidies for state-protected airlines is wrong, and if we weren't part of Europe, Air France and Lufthansa will continue to get state subsidies. As it is, the European Commission are now trying to get aviation under their belt, and hopefully will take on Air France and Lufthansa and hopefully get more competition going in Europe.
Would you like to see some foreign banks operating in England?
Yes, I think that European banks, the French, the German banks are very competitive, and it would be good for British business to be able to draw money from European banks as well as British banks.
Can you see a future for your businesses if we stay the lone person outside the monetary union?
I think it would be very lonely indeed.
Can you think of anywhere where the trading partners would be?
Can I think of what, sorry?
Where would our trading partners be? Any idea?
Well, I think they'll obviously move ahead, and I think it's important that we get in there and make it work.
And finally, Mr. Branson, is there a moral point about keeping into Europe?
Well, I think the point to remember is that for every generation past of my age group, we've been at war with people in Europe, and I think overriding everything that the other panel is saying, this is the first generation that we haven't been at war with each other, and that is more important than currencies or anything else, and let's try to work together.
But it hasn't required a European Union, has it, to prevent a war?
I think that, I've just come back from Germany, and the German people are worried about the extremists.
The German people are worried about themselves.
No, the German people, fortunately, are not worried about themselves. They want to make us become part of Europe so we can keep the extremists out. And I think as part of Europe, the extremists will be kept out.
Yes, you've told us you run an airline. And under the Treaty of Rome, can you pick up passengers in France and take them to Italy?
What the European Commission want to do is to try to get the airline industry under their belt.
No, will you answer the question? Can you pick up passengers in France and take them to Italy?
I can't at the moment, no. and I couldn't do before we went into Europe.
No, and you can't because in Europe they're reserved by the big airlines, the nationalised airlines.
And the sooner that's broken,
yes.
the better.
You hope that it will be broken. You see, Mr. Cook hoped that the cooperation with Europe would lead to beneficial effects on the British steel industry. But by reason of the protectionist policies operated in Europe, he has not gained the benefits.
So I think you must remember that if we weren't part of Europe, that the subsidies would continue on Spain and Italy on the steel industry. As part of Europe, we have a chance of getting rid of those subsidies, and I believe we will get rid of those subsidies.
Mr. Branson, do you realise, Mr. Branson, do you realise that we are not on this side anti-European?
Well, it's difficult to believe.
Well, you have told us that you have your record companies in Europe, a large number of them. You've gained all that with the present situation on cooperation. You don't need union for that, do you?
If we're left out of Europe, which effectively, if your side win this debate, we might be, then it'll be much, much more difficult for us to expand and trade in Europe.
What do you mean by being left out of Europe?
Well, we should try to get on, make Europe as much one country as possible so we can trade freely with each other. And we can try to learn from the good points of Europe. I mean, Germany's got a lot to offer Britain. France got a lot to offer Britain.
Do you know what the present arrangement is? That there's free trade in Europe. We've got all that.
All right, but if we draw a line between Britain and the rest of Europe, we won't get free trade.
We're not drawing a line between British and the rest of the country.
Can I just say what's one sensible thing that Norman Tebbit said, and that was that if this doesn't work out, we can opt to get out. So let's give it a try. Let's get into Europe. Let's try to make it work. And if it doesn't work, then we'll vote a government that gets us out.
Which government will you vote for to get us out?
I won't vote for a government to get us out, because I think if we get into Europe, we'll make it work.
No, because, Mr. Branson, by that stage, you will have no right to vote for a government to get you out.
Norman Tebbit made it quite clear that we would have the right to get out.
No. Because we would be controlled from Europe, and these people in this room...
On a point of fact, I think Mr. Tebbit did say that there would always be the ultimate right to withdraw as a sovereign nation.
The ultimate right to withdraw, but not to vote out the European Parliament and control.
Sorry, but OK, if we have the right to withdraw, we can withdraw if this doesn't work out. The people on this panel believe it will work out, and we'll go ahead and make it work.
You really think we should just put our toe in and see what it's about, and if not, call it a day?
I'm not saying we should call it a day, but if you are right, then we can call it a day, and it's very important to remember that.
Have you read the treaty and understood what it's about?
I've listened to Norman Tebbit, and I believe him on this point.
Thank you very much, Ms. Admiral.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norman Branson. Well, now, we've heard from Sir Christopher Tugendhat first, who wants more power to go to European Parliament. We heard from the German Christian Schmidt, who wants to see Britain in there, not least to help with their experience of democracy. And we've heard from Richard Branson about the advantages of being there, and he wants to see Europe as much one country as possible. Now, Mr. Scrivener's last witness is one of the most passionate pro-European voices in Britain, the man who took Britain into Europe in 1973 as Prime Minister, who's been a staunch supporter of greater European Union ever since. He said that his heart leapt with joy when John Major said Britain should be at the heart of Europe. Edward Heath, Mr. Scrivener.
Mr. Heath, we didn't join Europe at the same time as the other European countries. Was there a financial cost to us because of that?
Oh, we suffered enormously. The reason was that the Labour government in 1950, when the discussions began to form the first community, didn't take the advice I gave them in my maiden speech in the House of Commons. And that was, get into the negotiations, and then I wanted them to join. It then took us 22 years before we could become a member of the community, and we must never make that sort of mistake again.
What are the advantages of a single currency?
The advantages are very great, in my view. First of all, it is business, to a large extent, which wants it. Tourists and people traveling, particularly young people, will say when we've got a completely barrier-free market, why have I got to stop here just to change my sterling into the common European currency? And I believe there is another one which is very important, which is very often overlooked, and that is that if you have a common currency throughout the whole of Europe, then we can immediately judge what the price of every article is in each country and what it has cost to produce it. At the moment, if we say to a worker, what does it cost to produce well, furniture in Spain? What does it cost to produce a car in Belgium? What does it cost to produce any article you like? Of course, we haven't got a clue, because they're all in different currencies. Once we have a common currency, we can now immediately see the price, comparative price, and that shows us that we can't have excessive wage claims, because if we do, we're going to put ourselves out of the market with all these different goods.
What are the options if Europe goes on and leaves us behind?
The option is really, for us, I suppose, to be second line. It is said that we have the right to withdraw. There is no right to withdraw from the treaties. That is absolutely clear. Of course, we could break the treaties if Parliament agreed to break it, but there is no right in any of the treaties actually to withdraw from them. And so the alternative, unless we break the treaty, is to become a second-line country. Now, those who are asking what the consequences of that are must recognize that you lose all your influence. Why should the other members of the community take any notice of us if we're not playing the same game as they are, and if we're just outside on the second line?
If we don't join in this next phase, will we have lost the lead in any areas?
Oh, yes. Are you talking particularly about the single currency or about the whole situation?
The whole situation.
The whole situation, yes, of course we shall lose enormously. We shall lose on the single currency, and particularly, I believe, on the City of London. I had always hoped when I took Britain into the community, the City of London would become the leading monetary centre of the enlarged community as it grew more and more prosperous. Now, that's unlikely to be the case, and if we're outside, it certainly won't be the case. And we shall see either Frankfurt, or now it's at Amsterdam, and Paris also wants it, becoming the leading financial centre of the community. There's no doubt about that at all.
How important is the social charter?
I think it's very important, and perhaps in this I differ in some ways from my party. We've heard about the level playing field. If you're going to have a level playing field, then you've got to have people playing to the same sort of social charter arrangements as each other. I don't believe in pushing wages down and down and down, and then sacking older people and employing younger people, which is what always happens. And if the argument is that it'll cost us more to pay proper wages, well, then the logic which follows from that is, well, then reduce the wages still further and further, and let's have more unemployed so that you can keep on pushing the wages down. That's the logic of it all, and this is what my party has got to face up to.
Are there any other members of the EEC not in favour of the Charter except this country?
Well, I don't know of any, but we constantly hear, well, of course, other countries really think like us, but they don't say so. They don't vote in our way. In fact, as far as the social charter is concerned, I think that then all the remainder of the 11 do, but that we shall see very clearly from the present conference.
Thank you.
Mr. Heath, in a broadcast to the nation on the 8th of July 1971, you said this: they, meaning other member states, have their own parliaments, so shall we. They have their own laws and law courts, so shall we. Nor will anything be decided that is against any of our vital national interests. This is the way the community works. Any decision affecting vital interests has to be made with our agreement, and the same applies to the other members. The goalposts have moved, haven't they?
What are you complaining about in that statement?
Well, the position...
I know that Mr. Tebbit gave it to you because Mr. Tebbit has been quoting it over the country. And so I've read it again very carefully. I can't see anything to object to in that statement.
Mr. Tebbit has been quoting it over the country with some effect, as one saw at the Oxford debate.
Yes, and he was very careful not to read out what I said, otherwise they would have seen how wrong he was, and he had no justification for quoting it.
Is it...
Do you want to read it out?
I don't want to read out any further. I've got other important matters to deal with. It's true, is it not, that the control and parliamentary control will be transferred from Westminster to Europe?
Well, you see, you're talking all the time about the community and us, but we are the community.
Yes.
The community is us. And these are not two separate things in which you can say the community will do this to us, the community will do that to us. We are a vital, dynamic part of the community and take part in all its discussions. And what is more, Those spheres which come under the community are quite specific, and the rest comes under our own parliament and our own ministers. And to talk as though everything was being transferred to the community is absolutely unjustifiable in every respect.
Well, Mr. Heath, as you say that we are part of the community, and in fact we shall continue on that cooperative basis, whether we sign the treaty or not, will we not?
No, that's not true. You cannot imagine, I don't believe anybody here who belongs to any other sort of organization, whether it's a sports organization or whatever it is, and you get somebody who says, I'm joining, but I'm not going to pay my full subscription, I'm not going to play the maximum part, I'm just going to stay out there. Do they get full cooperation? Not for a moment. And the other 11 will say, why have we got to bother about them? They are not playing according to the rules which we've got for the community as a whole.
Well, Mr. Heath, we have, of course, had some experience with the community already. A prime example is Mr. Cook's experience in the steel industry. Why has he had no benefit from the Commission? Can I finish? Mr. Tugendhat suggested the Commission needed more powers. They haven't actually complied or enforced the powers they presently have.
No, with great respect, the Commission only has the powers which are given to it by the heads of government and by the ministers of particular groupings. We heard that there was the economic community. There was also, first of all, the coal and steel community, and that has supranational powers. And then we had Euratom to deal with the peaceful uses of atomic energy. And then all three were combined just after we became members and with our full consent into one community. Now, the British steel industry has been allowed very large subsidies by British governments, particularly under the Labour government, and it's been allowed large amounts of investment. And as far as the other countries are concerned, then it is a development question. We are constantly being urged now to help the Central European countries to develop. Very well, why can't we help Spain and Portugal to develop? I was responsible for bringing development policy into the community in the first summit conference in Paris in October 1972. And our purpose was to enable the different parts of the community to develop fully.
Mr. Heath, is it in everybody's interest to develop in the sense of building a steel foundry in Portugal when there's no need for it, and then in effect paying for it to run and making a gift, in effect, at cost or below cost of the products that it's being produced by it? How can Mr. Cook compete with that sort of market?
That's a matter which affects every industry, and in which the Commission and the ministers for that particular industry or trade in the industry can decide. Yes, and sometimes they've had to decide with us. Now, they can make a similar decision about any other part of the community. That's within their power.
Another prime example, the agricultural policy. Has that been beneficial and good and operative?
Immensely beneficial, and particularly to this country.
Well, can I ask?
Our production has gone up enormously. What's more, we have, since we came into the community, actually exporting butter to France and to the Netherlands.
Well, we know about
and now, as a result of what the last British Prime Minister did, our farmers' real income has dropped by 25% in 2 years. That wasn't the purpose of us going into the community. And what we've been doing has damaged our own people.
Mr. Heath, can you explain to this audience, when the British farmers export their lambs to France, rightfully, legally and validly, that the French farmers attack the lorries and burn them, and when the police try to intervene, and Mr. Heath, when the police try to intervene, the French farmers lock up the police. Is that the community that we want to go into?
Of course it isn't, and you are taking one small part of people who are infuriated by a particular action, and they take completely unjustifiable action themselves. Now, you're saying this country is without that sort of action? You're really saying that? Are you condemning the whole of the community, all it's done, the most exciting development in this century, because some French farmers feel that they're being overwhelmed by imports?
Well, you keep on about its excitement. It's true, is it not, that so far as Britain is concerned, Britain has a 40 million deficit with Europe and a 75 million surplus with the rest of the world, in particular America.
The amount of our trade has gone up from 33% when we went in to nearly 55% now. 55% of our trade is with the community, and it's balancing. And all the time we're hearing these arguments about the way we've suffered.
Mr. Heath, you would agree with me, wouldn't you, that what we need so far as in particular defence, security, health and environment is worldwide cooperation?
Worldwide cooperation is always desirable, but you have to have a sound basis for working for it. And what we see now is the former countries of EFTA, Sweden, Austria and possibly Switzerland want to join us. Why? Not because we're just a free trade area. They've got that. They want to join us because we're a real community.
But we can get
and the Central European countries want to join us because we're a real community. And if you destroy that, you are destroying the greatest achievement of recent centuries.
You're out of time.
We can get what we want without giving up our democracy.
Mr. Heath.
Oh, I don't want to give up democracy. I'm a member of Parliament. I've been a member of Parliament for 41 years. I don't want to give up that job. Mr. Tebbit is packing it in. All right, that's up to him. I'm going to keep going.
Mr. Heath, Mr. Heath. Yes, I must be. Mr. Heath, just before you leave the witness box, we heard from the other side about the restraints that will be put on a British government in terms of economic policy by joining a single currency. What do you say to those who think that this will be too harsh a regime for this country and that will increase unemployment unnecessarily?
I don't think it will be too harsh a regime, provided that we recognize what the challenge is and our industrialists decide to accept the challenge and our unions decide to accept it and the whole of our community says, very well, now we are going to make a success of our industrial life. We saw 20% of it abolished. 20% of our industry in 1980-82 because of the then government's policy, which wasn't community policy. We're now seeing another 20% being abolished. And what we've got to do is to be successful under the common currency. And I believe that can be done, and we can make a success of it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heath. Well, now that just leaves us time for a brief summing up by both sides and reversing the order we began in. We hear first from Anthony Scrivener.
This is an important night for you because we're talking about your future. You are the generation who will inherit this. You can send a message tonight by your vote to Europe and to your Prime Minister. You can tell him that you as a young generation want a future. We're not talking about nationalities and foreign languages. We talk in terms of one nation, and the whole nation is Europe. One of the advantages of tonight is that you've been able to, for the first time, to hear some of these politicians questioned, to find out what their reasoning is for their views which they've taken. What is the option if we decide to get off the train at this time? The Bruges group have done all this research. What have they come up with? Nothing. Is it Hong Kong we're to model ourselves on? What is it? There's been no alternative put forward. Where will our trading partners be? Despite all this research, we've had nothing. Sovereignty, we've heard. Well, you know about your own constitution. Why don't they support greater parliamentary control in the European Parliament? Why is it they don't want that, whereas our side do? We want greater protection, greater input by the European Parliament. They don't want it. That gives you some idea who's in favour of democracy and who is not. You've heard the nationality card played. You tell them what you think of the nationality card. Looking as you do, come from the background that you do. Tell them that you've had enough of wars. Tell them we want one market, one unity. You will find in the Treaty of Rome these important words. It talks about stressing the prime importance of what? Of the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. That's what the Treaty of Rome is about. That's why they want us in, because we can help them on forming a democracy. We can help them forming a new constitution. Your choice is yours. You can join the ancient Britons, or you can look ahead with us. It's your future. We would ask you to send that message to your Prime Minister, Maastricht, tonight, because he'll find out the result of this, and put your hands up to reject this motion. Thank you.
Ms. Appleby.
When you receive a letter from your local MP which says, "Dear constituents, the treaty was signed at Maastricht. In future you will be governed by people whom you do not elect and you cannot remove," and that is the hard facts. I'm sorry about it. They may give you better creches, shorter working hours, They may provide you with higher taxes. Either way, you cannot get rid of them. What will you think? Not even the United States has power to impose its will on other countries, but the United States of Europe will have such a power. It will have the power to exercise its will and control on each one of you. Your wages will be laid down, your conditions of labour will be laid down, and your taxes will be laid down. It will be no use writing to your MP in Westminster. Control over the monetary system is a strength and power of any government. Today, if you don't like that power that is being exercised, you can get vote the government out. If the government at Westminster attempts to exercise control over its expenditure in Europe, then the European Court will say, if you've exercised too much, you will be punished, fined. And our British government at Westminster will be treated in exactly the same way as a local authority today by this government. We shall be, in effect, a charge-capped local authority, and you must think very carefully on that. Some people resent the government at Westminster having such a power, but there again you put them in and you can get them out. With European integration, this will not be possible. Great Britain will be one of 12 with a majority vote. Our case is not anti-European, and it is wrong to think about it like that. People like to paint a picture of that, but our case is one of cooperation. Europe will not suffer. Cooperation will continue and strengthen. There will be cooperation, worldwide cooperation, in defence, security, health, environment, improvement. I would ask you to vote in favour of this motion. By so doing, you will know precisely where you stand. If you vote against, you will be writing out a blank cheque for Europe.
Miss Appleby, I have to stop you there because you've come to the end of your time.
I ask you to vote in favour of this motion and preserve your freedom.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, now, let's see how all that's gone down. At the start of this debate, our audience were divided 16% in favour of the idea that Britain had little to gain by further integration, 46% opposed that, and 38% of you didn't know or hadn't made up your minds. I'm going to repeat the motion once, and then let's take a second vote. The motion is that deeper European integration has little to offer the United Kingdom. Those in favour? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. And those who don't know? Thank you very much. Well, I have the result of that vote, as if by magic. Those in favour of the proposition, remember it is that European integration, deeper European integration, has little to offer. Those in favour of that and against deeper integration, 20%, that's up 4%. Those who are against that, in favour, in other words, of deeper European integration, 65%, up 19% from when we began, and the don't knows are at 15%, down 23%. So a lot of people have made up their minds, but I don't think it amounts to a row of beans because, as I said at the beginning, this is not a statistically selected audience. It's just a number of young people who came here to listen to this debate. And I'd like to ask them, and on their behalf, to thank our QCs, the witnesses who took part in all this, and indeed you, the audience. From Panorama in the banqueting house here in Whitehall, good night.